Welcome to our Grattan Institute webinar on how to fix Australia's housing problem. I'm Brendan Coates, the Economic Policy Director at the Grattan Institute, where I lead Grattan's work on housing. I'd like to start off the webinar by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and to extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The traditional owners of the lands upon which we now call Australia understood better than any of us the importance of land as society and housing. And that connection to land remains fundamental to their health, their relationships, their culture and their identity. And it's why I hope that we will soon see constitutional reforms to empower Indigenous Australians to, in the words of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, take their rightful place in what has always been their country. Now, today we're going to talk about housing. So unaffordable housing sits at the heart of some of Australia's most pressing public policy challenges. Low-income Australians are spending more of their income on housing they did in the past. Housing stress is on the rise and homelessness is also increasing. Today, home ownership seems to depend more on who your parents are and how wealthy they are than what it does on your own endeavours. And housing is potentially contributing to widening gaps between the rich and poor in our society. So what will it take for Australia to change course? So today's webinar will try to tackle some of these questions, what it will take for Australia to have a better housing system that better suits the needs of all Australians. And for today's discussion, I'm really excited to welcome two eminent speakers to help us discuss these questions. First, we have Malcolm Roberts, who's the lead author of the Productivity Commission's recent report into the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which was published last week. Malcolm was appointed as a full-time commissioner at the Productivity Commission in 2019, after many years serving as a policy advisor to ministers. Malcolm led policy development and advocacy for national peak bodies in the housing, retail and energy sectors. And over the past 10 years, his career is focused on energy policy. So welcome, Malcolm. Also joining us is Julie Toth, who joined PEXA as Chief Economist in August 2022. Her expertise spans property markets, land use, labour markets, demographics, immigration, industry, innovation and productivity trends. Julie has previously worked with the Nous Group, the Australian Industry Group, the ANZ Bank and the Productivity Commission. And she's a member of the Melbourne Economic Forum for the University of Melbourne and Victoria University, and a member of the National Economic Policy Panel for the Economic Society of Australia. Welcome, Julie. So today we're going to kick off with a short presentation from Malcolm from the findings of the recent Productivity Commission inquiry into the National Housing Agreement. So I'm going to hand over to Malcolm to make that presentation for about 15 minutes. Then the structure of today's webinar will be a moderated Q&A, where I'll moderate some of the key questions that we think come out of that review. And then we'll follow up with some Q&A from the audience, particularly from some of the pre-submitted questions that we've gotten from the audience. We've got over 100 pre-submitted questions. So apologies if we don't actually raise your question in today's discussion. So over to you, Malcolm, and I'll just bring up the slides.
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be with you too, Julie. And thank you everyone for finding the time today to listen to this discussion about a recently released report. My colleague on this inquiry, Bron Mokak, is in the Kimberleys doing consultations for Closing the Gap. So he sends his apologies. Firstly, we've got, as Brendan said, some slides to go through. It's trying to make as painless as possible. A 600-page report with 37 recommendations, an enormous amount of data and evidence. So if we could just go straight through that, Brendan, that'd be great. We'll get started. So we were asked to review the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. It's due to expire at the end of June next year. We were asked to look at how governments have performed against the outcomes and outputs, the objective of the agreement, and whether the agreement's suitable for the future. Next one, thanks, Brendan. As usual, the PC did our level best to consult as widely as possible to hear the views and the experience of everyone who's got something to contribute to this discussion. And some of the people on the call are probably people who have participated in those consultations or provided submissions, and so we're very grateful for that. We've made a special effort to try and talk to people who've lived experience so we can get a perspective of not just a desktop view, but a perspective of what life is really like in some of those areas under stress. And some of those case studies and stories are in the report. Next slide, please, Ben. Right, well, I think we'll be telling you a few things that you already know. Can we move on, Brendan? As Brendan said, we're spending more on housing than we've ever done. And when we consider the NAHA objective is to improve a set affordable, safe and sustainable housing across the housing spectrum, it's a very broad scope. And the very broad finding is that we are spending more and more money on housing. Sometimes that's a preference, other times it's a necessity. Brendan? We looked at the services that are funded through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which is essentially a funding arrangement transferring $1.6 billion from the Commonwealth to the states and territories. The outlook for homelessness services is rather bleak. More people are seeking homelessness support than they have before, and more are being turned away. And that's the problem that we've heard from service providers across the country. And when we look at social housing waiting lists, they are long, and a very large proportion of the people on those waiting lists are people who've been deemed to be in the greatest need. People who really do need to move into more secure and stable housing as soon as possible. Next slide, please, Brendan. The epicenter of so much of the affordability problem is the private rental market, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. We're looking at the situation facing low-income private renters. And bear in mind that 1 in 4 Australian households are renting in the private market. We're seeing more people renting and more people renting for longer. It is becoming a much more established and long-term segment. So just very quickly, those figures tell you that people on low incomes are generally struggling to meet the demands of their rent. Median advertised rents have surged by about 9.5% over the last 12 months. Vacancy rates almost halved over the last 12 months to about 1.1%. So we have a very tight market. Rents are reflecting that. And the people who are struggling on low incomes, whether they're on income support or they're working poor, are facing the prospect of paying more and more of their income on rent. Next slide, please, Brendan. When we looked at home ownership, we can see a long-term trend that home ownership for every age cohort is falling away. So in the aggregate numbers may be a movement of a couple percentage points, but if we look at younger households, we can see a pretty significant shift in the proportion of households headed by someone under the age of 35, let's say, and the extent of home ownership in that cohort. And when we look at the survey evidence, it's very clear that home ownership is still the most common aspiration. It's not a question of people deciding they don't want to own a home. Some might be postponing home ownership because they've got higher education debts, other things to do, but the aspiration is still very, very strong. Next slide, please, Brendan. So we looked at the agreement, and you'll see that it didn't perform terribly well. That probably wouldn't classify as a passing grade, and the point's pretty obvious. It's been essentially used as a funding contract. It's certainly given service providers in states and territories funding certainty over the life of the agreement, but it hasn't done very much more. It hasn't been used as a platform to develop a shared reform agenda. It's got a broad objective to focus on safety, sustainability and affordability across the housing spectrum, but it's got a very, very narrow scope in terms of the programs and funding that falls directly under it. The performance monitoring and reporting is quite poor. A number of the performance indicators are irrelevant. There's not the annual public report that the agreement calls for. In fact, the closest we have to it is the dashboard the PC provides information on 4 out of 14 indicators. Until recently, we didn't have a ministerial council. When the shift to national cabinet occurred, the ministerial council had disappeared. And when we look at the funding arrangements, they're based on historic formulas. They're not based on need. Thanks, Brendan. So what would that mean for the next agreement, which was the other part of the terms of reference? Well, we think the objective can be retained. It's pretty sound. But we think the agreement should cover the field. If we want governments to develop a coherent national approach to the housing and homelessness, it probably makes sense to have an agreement that covers the field and captures all the investments that are being made by government. We've suggested some principles that might guide policy and investment. And we've also said that obviously governance and accountability needs to be much stronger than it is today. Thanks, Brendan. And going back to the point about coverage, the NAHA is covering an annual expenditure of $1.6 billion. Governments are spending $16 billion in various forms of assistance. And so this gives you a sense that there is quite a lot of money in the system. You can also see where it's being allocated. And the NAHA really doesn't influence those decisions at all. It's not a natural forum for the Commonwealth states and territories to align roles and responsibilities and coordinate policy. Thanks, Brendan. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with 37 recommendations from our PC report, and I'll just try and give you a taste of what they are. The two key themes are, obviously, we need to make housing more affordable, especially in the private rental market, where the pressures are driving demand for government-funded services and where people are at most at risk of homelessness or finding themselves squeezed. We need to improve the delivery of housing assistance, with a particular focus on targeting support to the people in most need. And we need to be innovative and try and look for ways that we can be more flexible, timely, and cost-effective in the support we give to people in trouble. Thanks, Brendan. Improving rental affordability means tackling both incomes and rent. Rent affordability is a combination of those two factors. We've got quite a few ideas in the report, but the essential one for private renters is improving the adequacy and targeting of Commonwealth rent assistance. In terms of trying to influence price in the market, and we recognise that interest rates, supply and demand, a host of factors drive price. But we do think there are interventions governments are doing at the moment, which can be scaled up or accelerated. And there are possibilities to improve that side, the supply side of the story. Thanks, Brendan. So we looked at Commonwealth Rent Assistance, the largest single program. It's $5.4 billion a year. It's helping 1.35 million households. In design, it's reasonably sound, it's flexible, it's portable, it's timely. It's not tied to a property. It reflects the circumstances of the recipient. But we raise concerns around whether it's still adequate and whether it needs to be better targeted. We've offered quite a lot of advice about that through the report. We wouldn't normally like, after a 9-month or so review, to recommend another review. But given the complexity of the policy change, given it affects some of the most vulnerable people in the country, it affects 1.35 million households, it's important to get this right. And we do think that this should be within the scope of the next agreement, that we see that if you're going to expand the scope of the next agreement to pick up the leading Commonwealth state and territory policies, CRA needs to be there. Thanks, Brendan. Now, on the supply side, we have said planning reform would be helpful. We've heard from planners that that's exactly what they want to do. They want to see planning become a better tool to improve density. There's a recognition that continuous urban sprawl has high economic and social costs, and there are foregone opportunities to improve density, particularly middle ring suburbs where you're well connected to transport, jobs, services. We've suggested that the approach is to essentially get governments to commit to targets for new supply, and that will particularly require working with local governments to support them in delivery. And this is something that we were working on, but we're quite encouraged to see that the government has essentially taken up the same path and is looking to, through the National Supply Housing Affordability Council and the new national plan, is looking to pick up on this approach. Thanks, Brendan. On homelessness, it's a pretty bleak picture. We really do need to see more investment in prevention and early intervention. We need to expand the delivery of Housing First programs. There's a lot of uncertainty about the real level of need, so we feel that we need to assess that. We need to do a stock take of services to determine what the funding really should be. And we need to ensure that services have access to a long-term funding pool that allows them to be flexible when they're dealing with people with complex needs. Thanks, Brendan. On social housing, some people might be upset by this, but we would say that certainly it's an essential safety net, but it's a costly way to help people who might, with support, have options in the private market which they would like to take up. We certainly think financial support and tenancy support is very important, especially at a time of a very tight rental market, and we've been watching reforms at the state level there. We think there is a need to create a better, more effective private rental market, and we have revived a proposal that we had in a previous PC inquiry, but goes all the way back to 1946, believe it or not, that we can have a look at creating a portable rental assistance model, which would allow people to move at their own choice between the social housing and the private rental market. We might talk about that a little bit later. Thanks, Brendan. When we looked at where the money is being spent, and we go back to that $16 billion graph, you would notice that there was about 2.7 billion in 2020-21 being spent by state and territory governments on stamp duty concessions and grants. And that's assistance to home buyers. Now, we don't believe the public benefits from supporting home ownership are very strong. We think there are risks that some of that support might even feed into higher prices. But we also look across the board and say we've got significant affordability problems for a very, very large proportion of the community. That investment in home ownership is open to question. So we've suggested government should think about reallocating some of that support. And if we're going to continue with home buyer assistance, to tighten up eligibility and make sure it's targeted to people who would otherwise not be able to afford their own home. So there's that enduring problem whenever governments subsidise an activity. Are you actually achieving any additional activity, or are you really just supporting action that would have occurred anyway? And the last slide, I hope I've raced through at the right time, is that we've taken very seriously the responsibilities that we have, particularly under Closing the Gap, to listen to Aboriginal people, to consult with Aboriginal people. We recognise the very particular social and economic problems that many Aboriginal people face in the housing market, and especially the reliance on public housing in remote and regional areas. So we've convened a roundtable with a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing organisations and other stakeholders to try and plot a way forward. And we think there is a great opportunity here for the next agreement to really deliver on co-design for housing policy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And here are some of the things that need to be done. There's certainly a big task there. The NAHA was developed before we had Closing the Gap. There's at least one target in Closing the Gap, which is relevant for the next agreement. But we've also raised questions around, let's look a bit more carefully at that. Let's see if we can find some more meaningful targets and goals ahead. But as with every co-design process, it's a conversation. You work with the people and you try and ensure that you've got policy that really reflects the needs on the ground. So thank you, Brendan, for the chance to run through those slides.
Thanks, Malcolm. That was a whirlwind tour of a 500-600 page report. So I think we got through 100 pages every minute, about 15 pages, well, a fair few pages every second as well.
So a drink of water.
So that there's a lot in that report. There's a lot in the sort of the recommendations, the discussion. It's a whirlwind tour of kind of some of the big challenges in housing policy. And part of the reason we wanted to do this webinar was an opportunity to start to interrogate some of the things that were there. They probably got missed in, everyone writes up, journalists will write up a couple of stories on the report. Some of us will have deigned to try to read fair chunks of it, but
very courageous people.
Apart from that, a lot of people probably haven't gone through the work, and there's a lot of debate sitting underneath some of what you've suggested. So, but before we kind of get to those policy questions, I just want to unpack the size of the housing problem. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about rising housing costs for low-income earners. So has it gotten worse? How much worse has it gotten? And how did we get here? Why are we in this situation today?
Oh, they're all pretty important questions, Brendan. I mean, everyone attending this webinar will rightly say that this is a huge problem across the country, whether in a regional centre or capital city. And if we don't address the drivers of deteriorating affordability, we'll see homelessness continue to rise, the living standards of low-income households in the private rental market crush. We'll see a slow and steady shift away from home ownership accelerate. That's a pretty bleak picture. So if these trends are not reversed, we'll see more demands for assistance and already stretched services struggling further, and as well as widening social inequality over time. And so by most measures, the situation has deteriorated over the last 12 months or so in particular, but certainly over the life of the NAHA. Affordability has slumped, for the 25% of households renting in the private market. The vacancy rate, as I said before, is almost halved, 1.1%, and the median advertised rents are up 9.5%. Many home buyers, especially recent home buyers with little equity in their property and on paying variable mortgages, will be feeling the pain from the raft of interest rate increases since May, and I'm sure Julie can tell us a lot more about that. And all this is occurring against a backdrop of subdued income growth for most people in this country over the last decade or so. And it's taken an accumulation of issues to reach this point. So if we look at the precarious situation for low-income renters, it has been a combination of income and supply-side factors. Property markets have tightened, and the key factor affecting rents is obviously the local supply-demand balance. And at the same time, we've seen the real value of Commonwealth rent assistance for many low-income households has been eroded. And we shouldn't forget there are almost 400,000 households that don't receive CRA, effectively the working poor single-person households. And they're facing the same pressures in the private rental market. So unfortunately, maybe visibly to some degree, maybe incrementally over time, we have seen a number of the key benchmarks move entirely in the wrong direction. And I think now it's incontrovertible that we have a serious affordability problem.
So we mentioned there, we talked a bit about the supply story. So certainly Grattan's work would suggest that supply hasn't kept pace with demand over the longer term. But one of the really striking things over the course of the COVID pandemic is if you would ask most people at the start of the pandemic, if we're going to shut the international borders, we're likely to see rents fall, and that's what we did. But now we're finding a situation where we've actually seen rents rising and rising quite sharply for market rents over the course of the last 12 to 18 months, particularly in regional Australia. So Julie, how should we square the fact that we've got rents rising, we've also had house prices rising until recently, with the fact that the borders are being closed and they've only recently reopened in Australia?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Brendan, and it's an important one when we think about what sort of policy responses might be appropriate. Initially, I was one of the people thinking, hey, this is a complete mystery. Why are rents rising? Why are vacancy rates so tight? When population has actually fallen. We did have a period there where Australia, for the first time since World War I, had a population loss. So it didn't make sense. I have been doing a bit of picking away at this just in my time at PEXA and previously at NAS Group. And it's clear that there's a number of events and trends going on that are playing into this situation. And I think it's really useful when we go through these causes to think about which of them are a temporary response to COVID and to some extent will reduce or even resolve themselves over time as the effect of the pandemic wanes and borders reopen, and which of them might leave a longer term legacy that requires a more active policy response. So just picking through them, I've got 6 that I can think of that have contributed to this incredibly tight market that we're seeing nationally. And I'm sure others out there will have local factors that they can identify too. But certainly nationally, first there's the interstate migration flows. Now, that's a long-standing demographic pattern in Australia, typically going from New South Wales and Victoria up to Queensland, a little bit across to WA. That's a long-standing pattern, but it really, really accelerated and very quickly. So we did see a net loss in Victoria. That added over 50,000 people to Queensland, nearly all in southeast Queensland in a very short period of time. And that hasn't really stemmed yet. I think some of it will reverse, but even when it reverts back to its pre-COVID pattern, we will still see those flows. The second trend, which is related to that but has happened nationally, is, as you've already mentioned, Brendan, this flight from inner urban to regional to rural. Now, that one is actually the opposite of what we'd seen pre-COVID, where we saw younger age groups in particular move from regional areas into urban centres, mainly for study and work purposes. So to some extent, that one was the polar opposite of previous trends, and we would expect to see a little bit of reversal there, particularly for people that stayed in regional areas that might normally have looked at moving around for those purposes. The third one, and this has been really, really crucial, is the change in household size. We have spread out during COVID. People have wanted more space. And there were a few ways that people could react to COVID. We know there were people that moved in with family or moved in with friends, but actually the opposite was more likely to occur. Where particularly share households spread out, and people moving, for example, from the inner city to regions compounded it. So an example might be a share house of 3 splitting and moving to different locations nationally, and that becomes 3 households. So that's actually been really significant. The RBA did some work earlier this year that Dr. Ellis promoted in a speech, and their estimate is that trend alone, the household size change, has added over 140,000 households nationally. So, this single factor does help to, at least explain some of what's going on. The last ones are also adding to demand, but at a smaller level. So number 4 is the change in dwelling preferences, and this is about moving to detached homes, gardens, larger homes, and away from that high density inner urban living. So that's linked very much with the move to regional Australia. Someone that I was working with last week, for example, in a regional New South Wales town, explained that the work that they've done locally indicates that well over 60% of the new arrivals in their town are single or couple households. However, their housing stock is almost all older 3 and 4 bedroom homes. So they've got a lot of singles and couples in that town now living in what were family homes. The last ones are not so much related to COVID, but have been exacerbated by them. Natural disasters over the past 3 years, we've got another round of that now happening in New South Wales and Victoria, but that's probably taken out more housing stock than is commonly acknowledged. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority, for example, estimated that the floods in Queensland earlier this year, just in southeast Queensland, have taken out 9,000 homes that are uninhabitable. Others are still habited, but they're significantly damaged and awaiting repairs. There's similar estimates for northern New South Wales, and in Victoria, where I live, there are several hundred homes that are still waiting reconstruction following the bushfires in 2019. So given the other pressures that are going on, all of these are really adding up. Lastly, there's those weather factors and the labour capacity constraints mean that we're seeing much longer delays for people who are waiting for repairs and reconstruction, as well as the new building pipeline. So if anything, the backlog of households that are waiting for a new home to be built or for their existing home to be repaired is growing. So all of those are contributing to this incredible crunch we're seeing on the housing market.
So, Julie, some of those factors, hopefully are temporary.
Correct.
But, do you see the shift to regions as being something that's going to endure? People have moved to the regions out of the cities. Because that's going to have incredible implications for, the fate of the housing supply demand balance in those kind of areas.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that's one that is a wait and see. How will people respond to open borders in particular? Have we seen people moving to regional areas because they couldn't move overseas, for example? And for the younger cohorts, particularly people in their 20s and to a lesser extent in their 30s, will the lure of a garden and a chicken shed really be enough to keep them in a regional area versus inner city Melbourne or Sydney or work opportunities internationally?
So PEXA obviously collects data tracking property transactions transfers, as part of the conveyancing process. Are you starting to see that process reverse at all in either on the regional front or in terms of the average household size that expanded during COVID?
Yeah, so just to clarify for everyone out there, so PEXA is involved in the transactions of almost every property sale and refinancing arrangement that occurs across Australia. So we do see, that the vast majority of sales, not so much on the rental side, but just simple things like comparing the location of postcodes for property sales on the buy and the sell side. We can see that those interstate movements are slowing down, and the movement of people from one postcode to another. So the mobility nationally is definitely slowing down. Whether that's in response to rising prices or whether it's because that there's just less need to leave the cities again remains to be seen with further research. On the household size, one of the more interesting aspects was actually a decrease, an increase in the proportion of transactions that only had one person buying them. So that's the example of the share house, splitting up, people choosing to buy a home on their own. So homes that are owned by a single person have risen, and that's part of that. Just an indicator of household size. The estimated stock of housing has also slowed. So the actual number of homes out there and the transaction numbers are slowing.
No, that's fascinating. Certainly that's what we've seen. We are one of those people that got the larger house during COVID in order to not work from the bedroom and screen into these events from the bedroom. And certainly if you have, people upsizing, or if you have people buying more housing or being first home buyers, it does tend to reduce the average household size compared to where we'd otherwise be. Now, I want to come to the question of just supply. Malcolm, you raised this framework of we want to bring down the rents, and then we want to help particularly help renters. But in terms of bringing down the rents, you've put a reasonable amount of the blame, it seems, on the issues around zoning and planning, and suggested that the way we can resolve that is have the Commonwealth and the states come together, agree targets, then the states push the local governments to implement them. If I was playing devil's advocate, what's the incentive for the states? The states could do this now, theoretically, if they think this is a problem. So what's the incentive for the states to sort of take on what is potentially a politically difficult reform in pushing local councils on supply? Grattan thinks it's a big part of the problem, but how do you actually make them do that? How would this revised agreement actually achieve that?
Well, we've recommended a targets-based approach because we expect that states are more likely to commit to lifting supply if they are free to find their own way there. They have their own systems, their own strategies. Some already have regional and local government area targets. So we don't want to jeopardise achieving the outcomes by being prescriptive about the method. So we've got diversity planning systems. We're interested in the results rather than the nitty-gritty of how planning systems are performing and whether they need substantial change or not. Local government has to be involved, but states need to address the genuine challenges local governments have, and that can be funding issues, delivering development land and infrastructure. States such as Queensland have used funds to catalyse infrastructure delivery to try and pull together fragmented land ownership. It's not a very good way of putting it. So the states and territories are, doing work in this area. In some cases, we're suggesting, well, you possibly have the bare bones of a really effective strategy. We might look at the Six Cities Commission in Sydney, for example, and say, look, that seems like a good framework to have. Can we accelerate that? Can we tie it to a public commitment to deliver more supply? As for the sort of incentives, states have a lot of incentives to fix their housing problems. This is not someone else's problem. Governments across the board own this problem, and the returns to the states are pretty obvious. There are improvements in the quality of life for their citizens. If you want to be calculating about it, there might be some stamp duty revenue and other benefits to follow. So these are significant problems at the state level, and they do have direct levers to hand. They recognise the need in many cases to move things along. So we would hope that the next agreement provides an opportunity for something of a grand bargain, where the Commonwealth can look at what it can do and the states can look at where its levers are and coordinate to solve what is really a significant problem that it's just no use governments indulging in ritualised finger pointing and suggesting that, well, it's really your problem or your problem. With all levels of government have a contribution to make here.
So, Malcolm, some commentators suggest the PC is being naive in assuming that, say, changes to the planning system. And look, I agree, if you are going to do something, it has to be different by state because, Grattan's work suggests the constraints are different by state.
Yes.
But that you're being naive, and by extension, perhaps Grattan is being naive about.
We'll be naive together.
Reform planning rules. Well, I think it's worth. It's an important question. Because the idea is that the development industry, land banks, that it will drip feed supply out. And so if you reform the planning system and expand development rights, that you won't actually lead to more housing being developed. Instead, you've just given away a bunch of development rights for free, because if you expand development rights, you're giving that from something that's owned by the community to the landowner. So, is that not what's going to happen, and why not?
Well, we've given that a lot of careful thought, and we've spoken to a lot of players in the industry and elsewhere. First of all, we're not suggesting that planning reforms alone will suddenly produce massive new supply. Governments will need to tackle a host of other issues too. Infrastructure charges, local government financing, construction industry costs, we picked up on those throughout the report and suggested there's further work to be done there. In the report, we cite a range of local and overseas studies which have looked at the impact of planning on supply. We've also cited some case studies, including Auckland, which seem to offer good evidence that upzoning, for example, stimulates construction, especially in more dense housing in established areas. And in the case of Auckland, it would seem that some of those planning reforms have contributed to more supply and dampened rent increases that compared to other places in New Zealand. But we also, the PC reports always say on the one hand and on the other hand. So we've looked at the contrary arguments, including the risk of land banking. And obviously you have to have a set of conditions to allow land banking to occur. You need essentially a fairly concentrated local market where you've got essentially a monopoly or a oligopoly in place, where the developers have locked up supply and they've got the confidence they can time the market. Lots of people have that aspiration to time the market. It's not so easily done. But planning reforms and other initiatives can tackle those problems where they exist. Governments can intervene to remove some of the impediments that flow of new development land, and they can stimulate competition in the market. So we think there's an opportunity to do that. And relaxing planning rules isn't just about lifting supply. It's also should be about trying to support more diverse housing, better aligned with consumer preferences, and making better use of well-located areas, in our major cities. So, that's something planners absolutely recognise. And so we've got an evolving sort of spatial economy in our major cities, and planning, is an important tool to help that along.
So you sort of mentioned the preconditions you think you need to see land banking occur is essentially where there's market power on behalf of the developer to be able to control what's being released to market. Because if there's market power, then they can potentially do that. It does strike me that a lot of regional housing markets probably look a bit more like that than what some of the cities are. So do you think there is, a case for trying to do, and it is an issue that is enduring in public policy debate in Australia, is there a case for doing an inquiry of some kind into land banking to see how big an issue it is, particularly in regional areas?
Oh, we'd always welcome, a good objective analysis to see how significant the problem is or not. You're absolutely right that some of the smaller markets are obviously more prone to concentrated ownership. We've also seen situations where, because the costs of actually building housing has risen so quickly, banks are reluctant to lend in some more isolated areas because the actual land value is pretty modest, and the costs of building a home in that location, makes it a bit more problematic for the bank's lending strategies. So there are a lot of regional dynamics there, and that's a possibility. We're not dismissing the possibility of land banking, What we're saying, though, is that planning has a role alongside infrastructure charging, coordination, local government financing. Maybe we should look at rate caps, which are a constraint on local government's capacity to fund development, a host of other factors. So we're not fixated on any particular issue, but we are suggesting that the planning reform should be part of the solution. In fact, most of the planners we've spoken to have been quite happy to acknowledge that some of the potential of the planning system is being constrained by predictable political decisions from time to time or other constraints. So, no, I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that we can use the planning system as well as changes in other areas to facilitate new supply.
So one of the questions, Malcolm, one of the things you put forward in the review was that a call for government to urgently review rent assistance as a priority, and there's a strong case to improve its adequacy and targeting. So my question to you, the first question would be, why not nominate a figure for how much you think rent assistance needs to rise by? And a question that's come through from Brian Kavanagh is, wouldn't rent assistance just pump up rents? Wouldn't it just be captured by landlords at a time when vacancy rates are so low?
Yeah, well, on the first point, you'll be pleased we quoted your recommendation of a 40% increase, and we also quoted the Treasury estimate that that'd be $1.7 billion, I think in 2019. One situation is we respect that governments are juggling multiple demands on their limited budgets. So it'd be easier and very popular with stakeholders if every PC inquiry recommended that we spend billions in extra expenditure on a particular issue. But it'd also be a bit unrealistic if you stitched all those together, and possibly a bit self-indulgent on our part. So, we have made the point that the value of the CRA payment has been eroded, and we've also said the targeting could be improved. So we see an interrelationship between these two things. Depending on what your budget envelope is, we've pointed out how significant the erosion of the value of the CRA is. And now with 79% of people receiving CRA at the maximum rate, should we see further increases in rents that go beyond the CPI, that's going to be coming directly out of those family budgets. So that's a significant problem. So we're looking at a mix of things here. One is that definitely the value of the payments has been eroded. And we've shown a lot of evidence in the report about how different the impact has been for people on different payments, especially if you're on the allowances, which are lower payments than the age pension or the DSP, and the high level of rental stress. So there's quite a few things there that we've sort of signalled as a problem that needs to be investigated. We've also pointed out that about 1 in 4 CRA recipients don't need a CRA payment to avoid rental stress. So we think there are good opportunities for targeting. So you may operate within the existing funding envelope to some extent by reallocating support to people who are in greater need, and you'll probably need to also add to that funding. And we see that as part of that grand bargain I spoke of before, when governments are looking at where their respective strengths and weaknesses are and what they could bring to the table for a new agreement and for the national plan.
So my rough back of the envelope, based on the $2.8 billion in assistance to first-home buyers, is that could buy a 70 to 80% increase in rent assistance.
It would buy a huge increase. Now, of course, one of the problems here, though, and it's not so neat as that, obviously, because we're talking about state government stamp duty concessions and grants, as opposed to a Commonwealth income support supplement. So different levels of government are making, and that just reinforces the point that when we look at the $16 billion, there's a lot to be said for governments trying to find a coherent strategy where they concentrate on where their respective strengths are and use the levers they already have to better effect, pulling in the same direction.
So, Malcolm, as part of the report, you also talk about social housing, and it's probably, I would read it as a relatively mixed view of social housing, where, where rents are typically capped at something like 25% of people's income. So you have income-based rents. So you point out the fact that social housing, in your view, is expensive. Can you expand on what you mean by it's expensive? Why is social housing costly to the government to offer, to people on low incomes?
Yeah, I should say that we've said social housing is an essential safety net. We've said that if you look at the evidence of the waiting lists and the fact that about 40% of the people on those waiting lists are really in dire circumstances and an immediate need, that clearly there's a problem with the provision of social housing. On the other hand, we've also pointed out there might be other ways to help some people who are looking for support. That social housing is an important option, but it's not the only option for everyone. And there are some people certainly who would be probably able to be helped more quickly and more effectively with a different set of arrangements than governments investing in bricks and mortar. In terms of the expense, there's a number of different estimates, and we cite some of them in the report. You've got maybe $10,000 a year in terms of operating costs for a social housing unit, and maybe a capital cost of around $30,000. Different people have obviously produced different estimates. When you consider that Commonwealth rent assistance isn't tied to a particular property, it's portable for the individual, and assuming we can see Commonwealth rent assistance reformed and become a more adequate payment for people, you may well find that it's quicker, simpler, and it gives people far more choice to support them that way. Now, I'm going to immediately qualify that before people get outraged and upset to say we're not suggesting that works for everyone, but we are saying we've got a very large proportion of people in low incomes who are struggling at the moment, and we want to have a suite of measures to help. And governments investing in bricks and mortar is entirely appropriate and necessary. And many of the people in social housing are likely to be long-term tenants. The data shows almost 40% of people in social housing have been in the same property for 10 years or more. But on the other hand, especially as these pressures in the rental market, the private rental market, accumulate, there's a lot of other people who may not have a good social housing option available to them, may not want to join a waiting list and wait an indeterminate amount of time, who could be supported to stay in an appropriate secure tenancy with a different set of measures to support. So we're looking at a suite that takes into account the diversity of the people who need help today.
So I think there's certainly something to the fact that a demand-driven system can have some big benefits, right? So we've seen rent assistance spending, rise from just over $1 billion around 20 years ago, or $1.9 billion 20 years ago, to about $5.4 billion just before or during the middle of COVID. And so the system's responding, whereas social housing, one of the challenges is it does require, the cabinet of wherever the relevant state or federal government to commit the money at the time. And having worked inside Treasury in the past, that's really tricky to have that decision coming up all the time, because often they will say no. So I'm conscious of time, and I suspect we'll come back to social housing a little bit more in the questions. But Julie, we haven't talked as well. We've talked about homelessness, we've talked about social housing, we've talked about rent assistance. What we haven't talked about yet is the rates of falling home ownership in Australia, and particularly amongst younger, poor Australians. How much do you think is this a problem that should be front of mind for policymakers or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Brendan. We saw some good numbers in the report that Malcolm presented, and it does show that home ownership rates have fallen across all age groups, but particularly in those younger groups. I think home ownership is a completely reasonable aspiration, but it's worth unpicking why people in Australia are so concerned about owning a home rather than just being in one. What is it that they're actually seeking? And when you look at some of the evidence on why people are so concerned to own a home rather than rent, it's really plays to some of the problems in the rental market. Apart from affordability, it's about security of supply and longevity of rental agreements. It's about the quality of the housing stock that's on offer and suitability. So particularly for people with particular housing needs, it can be incredibly difficult for them to find a suitable rental property in the location and of a configuration that they need, whether that's because of family circumstances or disability or age. But certainly, having that control over your own environment is really, really important. And it seems to be something that is deficient in Australia's rental housing stock. And to my mind, we can address this by encouraging home ownership for as many people as possible, or we can think about, what is it that people are actually looking for here, and see if we can address some of that in the rental market itself, either in the private market or through social housing and public provision. But thinking about, mobility and flexibility of housing requirements, they are more diverse than, the traditional house and land package that Australia just keeps building.
It is a big challenge, certainly, Julie. Grattan's work is, I could imagine a universe where home ownership isn't the centre of tenancy in Australia, and that would be a perfectly fine outcome. Plenty of countries abroad do that. The challenges do really seem to be about, we've privileged home ownership in a way that it gets a privilege run through the tax transfer system with the age pension, gets a privilege run through the tax system.
Correct.
And if those policy settings were different, then maybe it doesn't matter as much.
Correct.
But certainly trying to improve the tenancy side seems really, really, really important. So probably a question to either of you that's come up during the discussion is, we can talk about rental tenancy security. The other question people are asking is, at the moment, with rents rising so quickly, should we have rent controls? Should we basically cap rents? This is a proposal put forward by the Greens recently. Is that something we should be looking at, Malcolm?
Well, I wouldn't profess to be an economist. I've got half an economics degree, but I have very clear memories of the test, the sort of standard case of rent control in New York, where the risk is that when you start capping prices, particularly if you set them at a particularly low level, you take away the incentive for investment. So if we wish to see, amongst a suite of measures, it may be more community housing, more public housing, but we also wish to see more private rental housing available. If you make changes that eliminate the incentive for investment, then you run the risk that you're going to see an undersupply. And so all the economics courses would start with New York rent control as having perverse effects. I've been a chair of a competition authority when we were setting prices on electricity or water or whatever. We had to keep in mind that we had to have not just a recovery of the sort of legitimate costs, if you like, of the business, the prudent and efficient costs, but we also had to be a little bit humble about things and ensure that we weren't squeezing margins, below those costs and making it difficult for people to make an investment decision. Clearly some people might respond to pressures like that by withdrawing stock from the market. And so it may not have a very positive effect at all.
It does raise the question, though, if you withdraw stock from the market, that stock doesn't disappear.
That's right.
The landlord doesn't set fire to the house the moment they walk out the door.
No.
They
might move it into short-term accommodation. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion around the impact of Airbnb, especially in some, attractive regional centres. I think the figure I saw of Byron Bay was 48% of the stock is short-term rental now.
Correct. There's entire areas around the country where we've got a bit of a role reversal happening. We've got the housing being rented out for holidays, and people that are living there long term for work purposes are living in the caravans and camping. Yeah. It's insane.
Yeah, and Hobart's another case, and Hobart has had a very, very tight rental market for years. These are genuine problems, and I suppose that's something else that we really do need to think about.
Well, that was actually one of the other questions that came up in the pre-submitted questions. Is in a world where we had unlimited supply, then it wouldn't matter about the short stay market. In the long term, we can build a lot more housing with the reforms that we've been putting forward. But in the short term, if you're wanting more supply for the long-term rental market, you either only take it from the home ownership market, or from the short stay market, or potentially from vacant dwellings. So should we be looking at things like Airbnbs at the moment if we want to deal with rental prices, rising rental costs, and rising homelessness in regional Australia?
I think this might fall into the category of thinking about whether this is a short-term reaction to COVID and closed borders that will not necessarily disappear, but certainly dissipate as borders reopen, as we're not filling up all of Australia with holiday homes and holiday accommodation. Conceivably, now that the borders are open again, the demand for those short-term properties will drop. There will be a large cohort of holiday, at the wealthier end, holiday makers that are now able to holiday overseas. They won't be going to Byron Bay or Lorne anymore. They'll be going further than that. So those homes are highly likely to come back into either the permanent rental pool or perhaps be sold to someone as a permanent home. So I think that will reduce. And Airbnb is quite recent. It's only a few years that we've had this type of arrangement in Australia, maybe getting up to a decade. So there's a settling in process there, and I think some of it will reduce over time, but where it is particularly concentrated in problem locations, there could be a role for a more local intervention.
It's a big challenge for local governments in some parts. And so it goes back to that question around the extent to which local governments have the tools, the resources to address that problem. And Julie's quite right. You have an absurd situation where some people who are the permanent residents are struggling to find anything like an affordable and appropriate accommodation. And you can have quite a different experience if you're hunting for short-term accommodation. But again, I think Julie's right as well to say that this is to some extent being turbocharged by the pandemic and those conditions. There's a wider question here as well about, what is the development path for some of those attractive coastal locations? Do they want to be surface paradise or do they want to be Noosa? And how do they manage all those other issues about ensuring that they've got permanent population appropriately housed?
That the short-term sort of rental crunch, particularly in regional Australia, it's just an issue that doesn't have easy solutions in my view, because the supply story is a long-term one. Rent assistance is a short-term one, which is got to be part of the solution to give people the incomes. But I do really wonder about the Airbnbs in the short term, just given where we are at the moment in the cycle.
No, I think that's very fair. I'd say one other thing too, though, is that's also about the scale and the capability of the local construction sector. You've got you've had some pretty significant shifts. I agree with Julie that some of those are likely to prove to be short term, and we'll see people reverse, if you like. But there's obviously a real shortage of trades. We've talked about some of those issues in the chapter on the construction sector. Putting aside the general story that for about 10 years construction productivity has been falling, we've got a broader problem about the availability of skilled trades and developers in many of these areas.
Some of this might also relate to the slow pace of productivity in design solutions for homes as well. So we've got the trade shortage to build, but also fairly slow at taking up possible productivity improvements on the design front. So, for example, modular homes, things being built off-site, and smaller homes, so which may suit the demographic changes better anyway. So, but can I just say on the construction industry side, there's a huge backlog of properties waiting to be repaired or built in the private sector, and this assumption that if we just chuck some money at the government, or if government suddenly just borrows and spends, we'll magically be able to build all these homes. The government departments that would be the clients are also in the queue, waiting for building trades, waiting for construction work to be done. And it is quite lumpy. We already have, big engineering projects going on at the same time, infrastructure that is required in order to alleviate some of these housing pressures. And it can't all be built at once, unfortunately. So, but to my mind, just moving some of that activity from public to private or vice versa isn't necessarily going to get things built faster.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Julie. So I think it is a challenge. If we think in the next couple of years, there's just so much activity in the sector, partly as a result of home builder, the stimulus from the Commonwealth,
Yes.
as well as some of the things from the states. Then you add on top, reconstruction from floods. That's going to add further to the demand for those trades at a time when it is hard to get them. Look, we have kind of run out of time. So there's many questions we got to, but many more that we didn't. For those of you that did pre-submit a question, rest assured I have them all. And there are some interesting ones there that will inform some of Grattan's work going forward. So there's a few interesting avenues there. But I'd just like to extend a thank you to both Malcolm and Julie for joining us today. For the PC report that Malcolm was one of the authors of, you can find that on the Productivity Commission's website. Grattan is also a not-for-profit. We try to make change in the best interests of Australians. So if you'd like to support the work of Grattan Institute, you can do so at www.grattan.edu.au. So all donations are tax deductible. So thanks again to our panel. Thanks again, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Brendan, Julie, and everyone who attended.
Thanks for the discussion. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.